Hello, hello. Is this on? Hi. Hello, everybody. My name is Sasha Sloan. I'm a tech correspondent at the Capital Forum. I co-write the Tech Tuesday newsletter with Sarah Morrison, the previous panelist, or the previous moderator. And today we're going to be looking forward, or right now we're going to be looking forward past the kind of remedies and legal issues we talked about so far, and try to think about what we want from a healthy advertising technology market, and how to create opportunities for smaller players. So I'd like to start by giving everyone an opportunity to share 2 sentences about themselves. First sentence about who you are and your experience, and then the second sentence specifically about your connection and your experience with AdTech. So if Karina, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I'm Karina. I'm a reporter and policy analyst at the Center for Journalism and Liberty, which is a program part of the Open Markets Institute. I focus on everything related to media business and how to encourage a market in which our press is robustly funded and ready to tackle all the challenges of the digital era. I am a journalist, also by background, and essentially had experience covering everything from business, venture capital, you name it, in the United States and South America. And I've spent the last, 3.5 years now, essentially looking at the cases involving AdTech, search, and Amazon as well.
Hi, I'm James Rosewell. I'm an engineer and entrepreneur that set up a B2B tech business which has got nothing to do with advertising at all. But I'm very concerned about the future of the open web, and together with Tim Cowan, who you heard from earlier, we founded Movement for an Open Web, which is the lead complainant with the CMA around Privacy Sandbox, and also with the European Commission, and engaged with the other regulators as well. We're a not-for-profit that's focused on the outcomes, so I'm delighted to be discussing that with you all today.
Hi, I'm Jason Kent. I'll be brief because you'll be hearing more from me, but just quick as a way of background, I did spend 20 years running major digital media businesses back from the first browser, and then I was kind of shipped off to DC to see if I could be helpful with the problems. So I've been absorbing, over the last decade as much as I can about public policy and antitrust and how you fix problems, while also hopefully explaining or teaching what I learned from running these businesses. Most notably at CBS, I ran their sports group. So.
Thank you to Capital Forum for having me. I'm Corinne Wong-Irvin. I'm a partner at Jones Day. I'm also a senior fellow at George Washington University. And I'll start with a disclosure that my firm represents Google in a number of matters, and I personally worked on the AdTech cases for about 3.5 years at my prior firm. My remarks today are my own and should not be attributed to Google or any firm client.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. I'd love to start with Karina and kind of get a sense from a journalist and researcher about what publishers have been saying about, especially smaller publishers, about what they're hoping for from the case and what they're looking for from the future.
Sure. So I spend a lot of time interviewing, just talking in general, connecting with publishers of all sizes, some ad agencies, and also participants in the AdTech market. My take really is that we've gotten to a point where publishers do feel there is a deep imbalance in how the overall market works. And I know we've been discussing about whether, what are the right approaches to separate the AdTech business, how that interacts with the search market. I think in general, if we really want to simplify it, my take from publishers is that a company that has such a massive power and control over the ability to discover news and also the distribution, the ranking of news, shouldn't at all be positioned to also act as a broker of advertising revenue. So we're talking about, the way publishers feel is, we're talking about essentially completely just displacing Google from the entirety of owning, the buy side, the sell side, the ad exchange, if we are going to allow it to continue having this dominance in search, right? So that's one thing, I think, just to take it to the very sort of ground level of my take. And then second, I think also in terms of something that I think hasn't been mentioned yet in all these panels is what are the incentives within the advertising industry to continue to lean on this market that essentially preys on massive surveillance of users, how the disadvantages the value of the ad inventory, the value of just like the quality of what we report, right? And then third, I'd also say it has a lot to the feeling in general from publishers, and I think most of the players in this market that I've been speaking with, it also has to do with how can we create an environment where other business models can challenge the status quo, right? And just coming from a very business perspective, I think that the AdTech case is really about understanding whether this system is adequately representing the interest of publishers and the interest of advertisers. So whatever efficiencies that publishers and advertisers perceive, and I think to some point efficiencies have occurred, I don't think that is necessarily on the top of mind right now of people in this market because of the imbalances of power that they've experienced. And just in general, from a purely business perspective, they just don't feel that their interests are being adequately represented. And so from that, I think that really is what is keeping both publishers and advertisers sort of attuned to what's going to happen.
Great. Jason, I'd like to turn to you next and kind of get your take on that. Specifically, like what you think a framework for a healthy market really even means, especially in your experience with your member organizations.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess I should mention in terms of background too, the member organizations are all premium publishers across news and entertainment. That's who I work for now, DCN. And we were designed to be focused on the future. And so, when people talk about challenges of the newspaper business or the TV business, et cetera, we're there to be exclusively focused on the future and not get stuck thinking about trying to defend past businesses. So what's the future advertising business look like? I think importantly, there's more agency for the consumer and the data consideration. So I think Karina's remarks are very important around surveillance advertising and the lack of control over that data. That's the root of the problem in many ways. That's where the dominance that we're seeing in the antitrust lawsuits all comes from. And so when you have a free flow of data that's not tied to the actual services that you're choosing to use, but basically any company that can get their hands on that data or watch what you're doing, that value gets shifted all over the place. And so from a publishing perspective, creating high quality content, news and entertainment that people want to consume, want to spend time with, and actually building trust with them and not sharing their data with people they're not choosing to interact with is critically important to the future ecosystem. It writes a lot of the issues. You also need to make sure that that data is part of the antitrust enforcement. They are very much integrated, consumer privacy data and the value of it with competition analysis. The one other thing I think that's important is I think I hit on partially because the 50 or so companies that I work for, some are big holding companies, even like your NBC Universals and Condé Nast, et cetera. There's thousands of brands, but there's also a lot of very small brands, local publishers, creators that I'm especially mindful of making sure that they can fund their content. And they've been overly dependent on Google. They've been overly dependent on behavioral targeting of ads. They're very worried about disruption, but at the same time, they have to understand it's kind of like being I think I haven't used this one before, but I was thinking about it. It's kind of like being in a casino where there's always winners celebrating in the casino. You always see people that are winning, but over time, the casino ultimately takes enough to keep their profit, right? And without that regulation, they actually would suck up a little bit more when times are tight. And so there's a lot of small creators that are out there, a lot of YouTubers that very much are somewhat happy, but overall, Google's been sucking up the profits, and so I'm mindful of them too. I'll pause there.
Sounds good. Corinne, I'd love to bring you in this conversation. I'm curious, your take, how we should balance kind of the interests of publishers and advertisers with those of consumers and kind of the end user there, especially given your experience working with the companies and also at the FTC?
Sure. So I have a lot of comments on some of the things been said already. Hopefully we can talk about that later in the panel. But I want to step back, right? This is a conference devoted to the antitrust cases against Google. And so I want to push back on the premise of the panel that we're not already seeing a healthy ad tech market. Now, to answer the question, of course, the focus is on advertisers, publishers, and internet users. And consistent with the title of this panel, which describes a unitary ad tech market, these individual groups do not care about the individual technologies that make up the stack, except to the extent to which they help them achieve their ultimate goals, right? With advertisers, they want to get their messages to prospective customers. Publishers want to monetize their content, and users want to have access to digital content for zero or low price or otherwise low prices because of the advertiser-supported ads content. And they also want to be shown safe and relevant advertisements without being bombarded with too many of them. All right, so when I'm going to define healthy, I want to define it in terms of the way the courts do in antitrust cases, namely a healthy market in terms of a competitive market that's characterized by decreasing quality-adjusted prices, by increasing output, and or by quality improvements. In other words, I want to define healthy in terms of the consumer welfare standard long set forth and used by U.S. courts. And importantly, the consumer welfare standard does not concern itself, is not focused on harm to rivals, and it doesn't require fragmented markets. Rather, its concern is prohibiting conduct that harms the competitive process and harms consumers. All right, and you asked a question about two-sided markets, and it was discussed a little bit on the prior panel. I think it's critical to understand the economics of multi-sided markets in order to understand ad tech. And multi-sided platforms are all about balancing the often conflicting interests of the various sides. Again, advertisers, publishers, and users. And so understanding this is critical in order to put the decisions, the individual decisions of ad tech companies into the proper perspective, that what we're talking about here, the ultimate goal is facilitating ad impression transactions. So what does the evidence show, right? We've talked about antitrust cares about prices, increase output, quality, and innovation. So in terms of output, U.S. display ad spending increased from $7.6 billion in 2008 to $150.6 billion in 2023. This is nearly a 20-fold increase. And importantly, output is not only exponentially grown, but it's outpaced projections over the period of time of the allegedly anti-competitive conduct. Prices, we've seen those, including Google's fees, either flat or declining, at the same time that customers and consumers are deriving greater value. So, for example, the cost per click has declined from approximately 55 cents in 2014 to approximately 25 cents in 2022. The click-through rates for Google Ads buyers have increased significantly from 0.2% in 2014 to 1.2% in 2022, which signifies that Google Ads is more effectively placing ads in front of the right targeted audience, which is causing them to click on them. Another example is that on the advertiser side, for those using Google's AdX, the average monthly revenue per 1,000 impression has increased steadily since 2014. And there's a lot of stats and measurements. I'll just list two others. One, antitrust cares about is there entry and expansion, and we've seen a lot of that, including from players like Facebook and TikTok and Amazon, who have been able to capture a significant amount of ad spend. Google's market shares have also been declining since the alleged anti-competitive conduct began. So, for example, the percentage of U.S. display spending that ends up in Google's pocket was no higher than 15% over the 2008 to 2023 period and has been closer to 10% in recent years. There's many more stats I could give. For those of you interested, show up at the Google trial and listen to The Economist. I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, when I got involved in this in the UK, that was in 2020, and the CMA had just published their market study into the digital market, probably one of the most comprehensive studies that's taken place. And there's a figure in that report from 2019 that's showing that the cost of digital advertising to every household in the UK was £500. Updating that now for 2023 from the IAB, that's £1,000. So that means this year, households in the UK are spending more on digital advertising through the additional costs of goods and services than they used to spend on energy prior to 2022.
Yeah, that's a
And
good
a lot-
report. It also says that Google's fees are at or below the industry average.
So clearly, there is an issue with advertising in terms of the cost to the economy through that report. And I would agree with you that it's not just Google that have a role to play in that. There's a question asked earlier about efficiencies, etc. But really, if we're going to address this, we need to look at the different constituents that are going on. So we might have a market failure. Google are a part of that. There may be other parts of that market failure. We've also got interoperability. Yeah. So actually, in the earlier panel when we were talking about Google's advertising technology, if Google maintain or Apple maintain with them, Gapple together, Facebook as well, a monopoly over the data, then it doesn't matter whether they run the exchange or the advertising technology because they're still going to have the data through the dominance in the web browser and the operating system. And of course, one of the ways they maintain that dominance is by abusing privacy. So a lot of people are concerned about privacy, but we really need to make a meaningful improvement in privacy. Just putting all the data into a small number of first parties and then not enabling interoperability so that the benefits associated with innovation can't flow is going to be a real problem. So actually, whilst we're talking about Google and AdTech, it's a significant part, yeah, and I think we're getting a lot closer to the remedies and all that kind of things as the previous panel have spoken about. But there's other things we've got to work out as well if we're going to come up with really good remedies. Coming back to the point about smaller publishers, where I live, if you want to know what's going on, you have to join a Facebook group. We don't really have effective local media anymore. Yeah, so when it comes to small publishers, they're going out of business, and that's terrible. I mean, that was picked up on earlier. So we need to find a way of having a viable economic model where not just the very largest, the 100-year-old brand kind of publishers can thrive and grow, but also new entrants can come onto the market and smaller publishers can survive as well. So we've got to look at far more than just one company.
Yeah, so I want to return to the kind of concept of fragmentation in these various markets, and it seems like we've kind of established like two different views of well, maybe it doesn't really matter if there's fragmentation if at the end the consumer gets what they think they want, and then on the other end that there is inherent benefit across different topics of fragmentation and fragmented markets. So I'm kind of curious. Anyone who wants to jump in on that and kind of thinking about the benefits and of fragmentation and yeah.
What's the correct number of participants in a market?
Yeah.
I don't know. I would say as many as possible to make it competitive. It has to be done safely. We need the interoperability to support it. We need to stop big tech interfering with that interoperability through their dominance of standards bodies and things like that. But ultimately, we want to have as many participants as possible operating safely. That's ultimately what we need. And we're not too far away from getting there. I mean, the technology exists. It's no new technology that needs to be invented.
So I would disagree. I think most people in this room probably agree that scale can be very, very beneficial, that there's a lot of value to scale, quality improvements. I don't think that you need fragmentation for competition. Judge Doug Ginsburg and I and Jorge Padilla have a recent paper out about dynamic competition, and that even assuming these artificially narrow market definitions that we're talking that the DOJ and others are proposing, even assuming those and that there were high shares alone don't really tell you anything. High shares can be just as consistent with anti and pro-competitive conduct, right? Creating superior products, creating the next best thing, you'll have high shares. And so in this paper, what we do is we challenge the notion that you need to have highly fragmented markets or even contestable markets, and this notion that high market shares over a significant period of time means that there can't be significant innovation and benefits, and the threat of preemptive entry, right? In these dynamic markets, we're not talking about competition in the market through static price output competition, but we're talking about competition for the market through sequential winner-take-all races won through significant innovation. So in this paper, we sort of test this claim by looking at the R&D expenditures of Google and Amazon and Meta and others, and whether they've declined since 2000, as one would expect if these markets were not characterized by dynamic competition, and that's not what we find. We find that these companies invest significant amounts both in absolute and relative terms, and that they've continued to invest with invested with increasing intensity over the time in which these firms' market shares have allegedly been growing. So I think this idea that just sort of big is bad ignores that superior products result in high shares too. And so we really care about is there exclusionary or predatory conduct that is the result, the but-for cause of the competitive harm. And I think most of these cases really boil down to refusal to deal claims, which are very difficult to bring and win in the United States, and for good reason, right? Our Supreme Court is much more concerned about harming incentives to innovate, about courts as central planners, as Judge Mehta talked about in his decision in rejecting the refusal to deal claim, and about facilitating collusion, and they're much more concerned about the type 1 rather than type 2 errors.
Guys, Jason and Karina, I'm curious if you could kind of provide another view on maybe not only what the antitrust laws prescribe, but also what outside of that, like bringing in privacy. I'm curious, like the benefits of competition on privacy and how we can factor that in here.
I can start. So I do want to go back to the issue of prices for advertising. So specifically the AdTech antitrust case, I mean, it's true that we're looking at essentially the prices per impression that are being transacted in what we call the open programmatic market, right? I think that, I mean, unfortunately, because this case will focus on that, we won't be able to compare sort of the evolution of the prices also on the display side of these monopolies, which if you read any marketing blog post or any ad agency will tell you that essentially the prices to advertise on the platforms that are property and operated by Google and others have increased, right? That's on one side of the equation. And then in terms of the intermediators themselves, right, we're focusing on Google sort of sitting at the buyer side and the sell side, also at the intersection of them both. And really when you ask publishers, yeah, sure, you can go to another rival, and Jason, won't let me lie about it. In general, publishers do contract with different partners on the sell side that also team with other market players on the buyer side and at the ad exchange side. But even if a publisher does not want to have their ad inventory touched by Google because they don't want to essentially give up their audience data, it will eventually end up there, right? And this also, I think this, in the end, comes down to what the previous panel was discussing, which is sort of the complexity and sort of the opacity and the lack of transparency in really sort of understanding how is it that as publishers we can have more control of who is touching our ad impressions in general. So that's one thing. And in terms of privacy, I do think that we are focusing right now, of course, in whether the court, how is it that the court is going to assess whether there was predatory behavior, was there any exclusionary behavior as well. But in the end, for the future, I feel of a healthy publishing industry that interacts also with a competitive automated programmatic market for advertising, we cannot ignore the side of regulation, and that does come to understanding that we do need some sort of, I'm not sure if like blanket measure on the way we collect, use data, and how we value that data. Because there's a lot of discussions right now about third-party data, first-party data. In the end, wherever the data is coming from, whoever has most of it and whoever can assign more value to it, if they have visibility of the perceptions of the advertisers, if they have visibility on the availability of ad inventory, there's something that's going to happen in between where they're going to be able to get some money for themselves and nobody's going to notice, which is really what this AdTech case is about.
Yeah, I just need to call out a myth on that. There is no such thing as first-party and third-party data. It's about risk of harm.
How we're used, this is how we've
Which is one of the things that needs
used
to
to
change.
talk about it.
Yeah, so when we talk about remedies, I was saying earlier, it's not just about Google, it's also the narrative that needs to change. We actually have to have an honest conversation about privacy. And Google investing those billions in Chrome and Android, for example, in order to cement their monopoly and build those walls even higher, that's not on. Yeah, we have to stop that. We have to make sure that data can be exchanged. We need that to be fair, it needs to be trustworthy. But data needs to be exchanged so that we can have multiple participants in the market. How many there need to be? Well, that's another debate. But we certainly need the ability to have that interoperability.
Let me jump in.
Yeah.
There's a lot there, so I'll try to be tight. I'm not going to debate quality-adjusted pricing. Judge Mehta threw that out I think in the trial and as part of their defense, and so read his opinion. And I'm also not going to debate first versus third party and just say that, those definitions are squishy based on, very dominant first party deciding when first party exists and when it doesn't. But in lay terms, if I'm a user or a person and I choose to interact with an app or I choose to interact with a website, I should be able to have my data stay within that experience and not be absorbed and listened to and watched and used for value by other parties that I haven't chosen to interact with. I should have that choice. And if a company is so powerful and exists as a gatekeeper in multiple places, so Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, or YouTube and search, or AdTech, that other participants don't have a real choice not to interact with them as a company. It's frankly very, very difficult to impossible not to interact with Google as a company, whether you're a user or person or a company in the media business. And the same is true with Facebook, including your example of your local news coming from Facebook for your schools. That's a problem. And so that's where data and antitrust need to be integrated. They are being integrated in a lot of these cases. And we're having, I think, an evolution of antitrust enforcement, and that's wonderful. And so the consumer shouldn't have to give up, their reliability and their trust as part of an experience in choosing to interact with an app or a website. And that's fundamentally at odds with trusted brands. You choose to use Paramount's product or HBO's product or the New York Times product because you have some trust in that brand and what they're going to do with your data. I'd like to have that same choice wherever I go on the web.
Yeah, but what we see happening is that you have consent or pay coming in now. So you either surrender a credit card number, which is directly identical.
That's garbage,
personal
though.
Information.
That's going to get thrown out.
It's everywhere in the UK. All the publishers have moved to.
Well, no, for markets where there's not enough competition. So Facebook has made that argument, and it should not be a defense because you cannot choose not to use Facebook. I do, and we probably disagree with this on this, James. You can confirm. I think an individual publisher where there's healthy competition should be able to set the terms of the deal in terms of, hey, we're going to use your data, and this is how we're going to use it as a subscriber. And if there's competition out there, then you're going to lose that person if they don't like the terms.
Yeah, privacy is a non-price factor of competition. So, yeah, the publisher, should be able to do that. I think we also agree that a publisher should have the choice not to use Google if they don't want to.
Correct. I agree with that.
But I also would say that it's not for consumers to control B2B supply chains. When you buy cornflakes, you don't get to say who provided the oats. Yeah?
I agree with that, but I don't want to buy the cornflakes and then have some other data broker or scuzzy company that is able to get involved with that because I want my cereal to taste good.
Yeah. So this is what I think is really, really important: is we can find a situation that actually helps both for privacy and the situation with Google. If we could shine a light on how data was used, actually within Google, within other organizations that compete with Google, then that will help with enforcement. It will help people understand what's going on. It would help them trust the overall system. It would help them better understand the value exchange with their attention with publishers. Yeah, we might then see less but higher value advertising, so the pages aren't 80% adverts. Yeah, so there actually could be a whole load of positive benefits if we pull on that thread. And that's what I'm really excited about. And we're now at a tipping point where we can start to do that, not just through the regulation, but also an honest dialogue about these things.
Yeah, so assuming for the moment that the result of the DOJ's case and the Texas case are that the advertising technology market is shaken up and Google's role has changed, how do we imagine the role of surveillance advertising, as it's been called, in that new world?
It would help if we didn't call it surveillance advertising for a start. Let's use different words.
Well, why
I call
not?
it that.
I'm curious.
It's funding the media. Yeah, advertising's been
I
around.
work for the media. I call it surveillance advertising. And the user should be able to choose not to have somebody watch their data and then go use it elsewhere.
Of course.
They'll still get funded. The publishers will. You just need to have acceptable rules.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Privacy is a spectrum. Yeah, you basically saying yes, some people should have that choice. Some people might be happy with personalization. Yeah.
Personalization.
I think there are
Well, I think personalization is quite important. It's quite useful.
two things there. So my impression really is the reason why we have to call it, and I also do call it surveillance advertising, is because it's really something that has been pushed to us. Like if you look at the overall ad spending or ad revenues, consistently, I think, at least for the last 10 years, search has been a really big part of it, social media. So like the pie of ad revenues that are distributed among other web publishers, news publishers in particular, has gotten smaller, right? So there are publishers out there, local publishers, niche publishers, that work really hard with other ad tech partners not to prevent sort of loading these codes that will track users across the web. But then they can do that, and that's great. But in the end, the 99.9% of the market is doing the opposite, and that is because we have this digital monopoly sort of pushing that practice, right? And so I think we do need a redefinition of behavioral advertising, because right now is written under the terms of the big intermediators and the big sellers of advertising, which are essentially search, social media, now more increasingly Amazon, e-commerce retailers. So I do think we need a new definition, which targeting is not something that will entail them knowing my precise location everywhere I go. And when I turn off, my Google Maps data collection, that it actually does happen, because we have had cases in which Google has not really, deliver on that promise, and I'm choosing not to do that, and it's still happening. So like, where do we find, what's the end game, right?
So your privacy
I'll
is not
jump-
improved by one company knowing everything about you.
Yeah. Well, you want.
Yeah, I just thought I'd jump in on a couple points. First of all, I'll say this is a really tough audience. I don't think I've been at a conference before where I've had people in the front row rolling their eyes at me, shaking their head, making noises. It's pretty uncomfortable. So I'll just put that out there. Okay, a couple thoughts. First, just coming back to your point about Judge Mehta rejecting the notion of quality-adjusted prices. I don't think he rejected that as a notion, and we're talking about the AdTech cases, so I don't really think that's relevant. In terms of the, all the talk about conflicts of interest and, this idea that the whole matching engine will be better or perform better if only Google wasn't integrated across the stack, there's just no fundamental economic support for that. way to think that. In fact, the U.S. DOJ and FTC have long recognized, until this administration, that there's a vast body of empirical literature that indicates that vertical integration is generally pro-competitive or benign. As the DOJ and FTC explained in a recent OECD paper, there are all kinds of benefits, including quality improvements, innovation from coordination, eliminating the double marginalization problem, eliminating the problems with incomplete contracts, the moral hazard problems like, sorry, it's really hard when you guys are just talking in the audience. I feel like it's a little futile to keep talking, but I'm going to try. It doesn't seem like there's any open-mindedness in here, but I guess, to me, the economic literature is a robust body, and I'd like to know what's changed, right? And I think that, let's come back to case law. What do we expect to see in the decision? I think, as was discussed on the last panel, these are multi-sided markets, and our Supreme Court in the Amex decision made it very clear that in multi-sided markets, we focus on market-wide output, which makes sense as a matter of economics, because in those markets, price is a much noisier signal of consumer welfare than it is in one-sided markets, right? You can have simultaneously predatory prices on one side while you have super competitive prices on the other. But the output on both sides will be identical, if not highly correlated. So, we'll wait and see what happens. I think the Google search case, like it was said on the last panel, there's a lot of good things in there for appeal in terms of recognizing that Google's product is the best on multiple dimensions. The testimony from Apple that there's no amount of money that Microsoft could bring me to switch. And so, there's a real issue with the DC Circuit standard on but-for causation from the Rambis decision, which was decided after Microsoft, that I think will be a real issue in terms of the problem of causation in that case. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. So we'd love to open it now up to questions. Quickly, we can take a few questions if anyone wants to raise their hand.
Yep. I guess I'll start with a question for Jason, because you said something that really jumped out at me. Personalized advertising is highly efficient. It creates cost savings that are reflected in the cost of consumer goods. So when you say that consumers should have a right to opt out of it, you're essentially saying that consumers should have a right to demand economic inefficiency. And I'd just like to understand, why do you think that?
Well, to be clear, and that's why I smirked at the word personalization, because Google's and the industry's gone through a changing of definitions and a rebranding of behavioral advertising over the last decade. Personal ads, interest-based ads, you can go down the list. So personalization is a fairly loaded term, but I think by what we would agree on is it means it's more relevant to the consumer. What I was speaking to was actual tracking of the user across the web outside of the services they choose to use. I don't think that's actually personalization. In the interest of a little bit of light-hearted humor in the room, Google very much in the discovery seemed to change and use the term personalization as kind of a rule inside of the company. They had a lot of communicate with care policies, and they started using that word, and then they started using the code P13N in their strategy documents. They wouldn't use the word personalization because they probably knew that people were going to start searching for it. So it's a fairly loaded term. I think to your point about the consumer, I don't know that I would agree on the economics of behavioral advertising or personalization just being more efficient to the consumer welfare. I also wouldn't agree with the load. There's a lot of garbage industry research out there that says that, this ad is worth more because I've got the consumer's data and I can target it better, so it's worth more. That is a narrow look at the advertising industry just at a specific set of ad impressions, rather than looking at the entirety of welfare across the ecosystem and how it actually shifts. And there are, I think, more sophisticated researchers out there that have studied that, and I could recommend them, if you want. So.
Yeah.
I'd like to support what Jason's just said around customer expectations. So if you provide your data for a particular purpose, for example, then it's not on to use it for a purpose that the person didn't consent to. Absolutely. And if that's what we mean by targeting and surveillance and that kind of thing, then absolutely that's not on. But then data is used for several different purposes. So, for example, assessing the value of an advert or the billing associated with an advert, for example, particularly where you've got multiple interactions with the brand. Yeah, that doesn't involve personalization at all, but it's an important feature that advertisers pay for. So as long as advertisers are prepared to pay more for that feature, then they'll go to the organizations that can provide it, like Google and Meta, et cetera, because of their scale, which means smaller participants. And when I say small, I mean most major publishers, including the premium end, because they're very, very small compared to the reach of the big tech companies. They won't be able to offer a proposition that advertisers will find compelling. Therefore, the price of advertising will not be true. It'll artificially be inflated. Therefore, households pay more for goods and services than they otherwise should. So we need to look at how the data is used and how do we make that rebuild that trust relationship so we have privacy, fairness, and trusted interoperability. So that has to happen in parallel with all this legal stuff that's all wonderful. We have to do that if we're going to come up with a remedy that genuinely solves the problem for the digital market.
We agree on that. And can I add one other thing, which might strangely put me at odds with some people in the room and actually might make me more in your camp?
There's one.
Ironically. I actually believe that on Google search, if you're searching for something, that data creates more efficiency, to your question, and helps return more accurate responses, and that's completely in line with consumer expectations, to use James' term. So the issue there is they have 98% of the search market on mobile, and so you have a different issue in that you don't have a real choice. But that first-party experience of search, being able to use your data to serve up ads, is completely acceptable. I know not everybody agrees on that, but...
Well, I think that's really important when we consider the first panel and looking at opening up the index as a remedy. So you open up the content that Google have in the search index, but actually that doesn't give you the technology that you need on a wholesale basis to build a product on top of it, because you need to have the history and how that index was interacted with as well.
Then we
So,
see problems.
so yeah, exactly. So yet again, we come back to the problem of how do multiple parties, multiple data controllers, exchange data in a safe way. So when we come to remedies, we've got to address that problem. Otherwise, the remedies that the courts come up with and that are considered and put forward are not really going to be effective. So solving that is probably the number one issue we're not talking about.
Well, I think that, there's the difference between the stated and revealed preferences. We've seen that again and again, that what consumers say on surveys when you ask them open-ended questions like, do you care about privacy, without asking them about the trade-offs, versus how they vote with their feet. I think the other thing is the privacy paradox, but there's also the fact of, it's interesting, if we're very concerned about privacy, then you want compulsory data sharing. That just means more people have access to the data.
Well, not all data is personal data, and data can be anonymized. You could use data that's not personal data to achieve the same outcome. And we see this at the moment. It's absolutely perverse what's happening with privacy. Yeah, we've got more and more organizations asking you to surrender your personal data in order to be able to access, whether that's an email, a mobile address, payment, etc. Yeah, when random IDs, that are used within Apple News, by the way, go and look at Apple News' privacy policy. It talks about how they use random IDs to protect people's data in the Apple ecosystem, can actually be used, and they're far less risky.
Just as a last thought to that, a lot of data can be collected. Not all data needs to be used for advertising. Not all data needs to be stored for as long as 18 months or whatever it is the policy now that Google has and others. And in general, not all data needs to be merged. Not everything needs to be mixed. And there is a very big difference between having a publisher or a number of small publishers who own one or two properties, understanding what the profile of their readers is versus having large platforms, and I want to bring Amazon to the table too, and other companies that are also increasingly using their digital properties, which they have many of, to collect the data and use it for whatever purposes that people do not know it's currently being used. So I'd like to make that difference.
Thank you.
It'd be nice if Google actually siloed the data so they didn't commingle it at all and ran actually every service as a separate service. Then we'd have less of a problem.
Just break them up.
Oh,
Okay, so I
Got
think
a
we have
new
time
idea.
for one more question.
Well, I have to intervene because, of course, Karen, you said that we were closed-minded people, but fundamentally, I don't know how you can come here and say the kind of things you said in 2024. I mean, if you had spoken about these arguments in 2004, maybe I could have forgiven it. But every single one of the points you made are things that have been debunked long ago. I don't know how you can talk about you and your co-authors uncovering these insights, which have been totally undermined by 20 years. So really, this is a dynamic industry. How many times have we heard that? And we know that this is worthless as a justification for where we are. Big isn't bad. Okay, yawn, we know that. The point is, we are talking about companies, in particular Google, which have demonstrably engaged in practices that are anti-competitive and have led to this monopoly. Coming here to tell us that there is dynamism in the industry, big isn't bad, that you can be having a large market share and that can be consistent with being efficient, is zero news. It has been it's been what people have discussed at the beginning of time, and we no longer believe that that is a justification for anything, because the evidence of the last 20 years has been entirely in the opposite direction. So I find this kind of argument when you say we've looked empirically at the evidence that there is spend or R&D. This has been there for 20 years. And these companies have said this kind of baloney, frankly, for 20 years. And in fact, what about the counterfactual? What about the counterfactual? What would the world have spent on R&D if there had been less monopoly? We know this, it's been there from 2001. I was arguing against Microsoft at the time, and Microsoft in 2001 was saying, we cannot be touched because look at all the innovation we make, and we make all of this stuff. And the argument was back then, yeah, but if you are going to be taken back a bit, there's going to be all this other innovation, which is going to be overwhelming what you do. So, I mean, this stuff is dead. I don't know how one can come here. We're not closed-minded. It's just that this stuff doesn't go anywhere anymore. Just to say.
Yeah, no. I mean, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I'd love
can I
to
jump
see
in
the
as-
studies.
Can I-
Yeah, good.
Just in this, maybe it's because I work for a bunch of media companies and I appreciate the plurality of media and we need more of it, and that's why we're solving antitrust issues. But I do like sitting between somebody who I haven't always agreed on privacy and third-party data, and between somebody who, very much represents Google's point of view. I think it's good. It's good, to have that discussion. So I do want to say that I'm glad that discussion happened rather than everybody having my viewpoint. So I understood, and things need to be corrected. So
I've heard that I was on a panel recently with one of your co-authors or one of your, Fiona Scott Morton, who made the same arguments. And I asked her to please send me the papers, and I'm still waiting. So if you have any papers that rebut the empirical evidence from Francine LaFontaine, former chief economist at the FTC, the meta studies by many DOJ and FTC economists, I'd love to see them. And I think in terms of the argument that we always hear from your side is the but-for world would have been even better and it would have been different. I mean, as long, to me that needs evidence, it needs some proof. And the idea that, all the innovation we're seeing is just, is not good enough. And to me, it needs some evidence that the innovation we're seeing is of no value and is all about creating barriers to entry. And I guess I'm just very concerned that, this rent shifting, all this rent seeking, seeking to shift rents away from Google to other players, can really have far-reaching implications beyond just distributional. It can actually result in value effects that reduce the size of the pie for all. I get it. People want to rent shift. People want to pay less money. And a lot of this comes down to, just wanting to pay less money. But I don't think that's where our government should come in and help rent shift.
Thank you all so much. I'm really glad we got the opportunity to hear from this diverse array of views, and I really appreciate everyone participating in this conversation. And so thank you.